The comprehensivity, I think Bucky, um, I've gone, I love talking to CJ about this because, he'll throw something out and I'll throw something out, and then he really does sort of live with the changing feedback, and he really is grateful to get it. And that is, I think, a comprehensive approach, and his attraction to the mistake mystique that Bucky talked about, which is the idea that if you're paying attention, there's no such thing as failure. There's always an increase in knowledge. It's not a good or bad thing. It's not, oh, I succeeded, And a lot of people, like when when he built that first dome out of Venetian blind like material, and it collapsed, all the students were depressed, and Bucky was so happy. Everybody said, why are you happy? And we said, well, we learned that doesn't work. And it was like, now we can try something that might work. And so I think a key word for him that he began to use more and more was universe. And he began to really often lead with that. And in talking back and forth with CJ, it's that sort of I keep saying omni, but it's macro comprehensive, micro incisive is the way he phrases it. But omni comprehensive is also works. Love is omni inclusive. There are all these sort of the whole shebang kind of thing that I think is an aspiration. It wasn't like it was even humanly possible for one person to do it. But he truly did, I think, believe in a hive mind that was connected by what he called mind versus brain. And so he used to define environment as everything that's not you. But universe is everything including you. So universe doesn't exist without your existence. And that's when it begins to overlap with, I think, the Gita. And apparently when he met some people in Bali, some of the priests there, they felt they had a lot in common with him, because he would, but he also paid attention to the details. And he could really, Allegra made this clear to me, that he could really dial down into the details. So when he sort of walked away from the 4D tower house, he immediately began to get the ideas for the geodesic dome. It was like once he gave up that thing, which he decided wasn't going to work, not that it wouldn't work, but he was frustrated by the way certain things got involved, and there were a lot of disappointment on both sides about that house and why it happened, why it didn't happen. But Allegra said as soon as he let go of this house that he was frustrated with, suddenly the geodesic geometry began to explode in his head, and he was able to move to the next step, which was a better model of totality and comprehensivity than the 4D tower house, which was sort of a pole with a tent hanging from it that was all made of aircraft materials. But it wasn't the bigger it gets, the stronger it gets geometry of the dome, and coming out of the icosahedron. And so universe was an important word, because even his great aunt, Margaret Fuller, in her book on women in the 19th century, you don't get very far in that book, and she starts to talk about universe. And I began to meditate on that, because I was working on another project based in Boston. Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward, and working on an adaptation of that. And when I visited Boston for the first time, I realized it sort of thought of itself as the hub of the universe. And then I realized every Bostonian thought he was the hub of the universe. That's just what Bucky grew into. The transcendentalists, and the transcendentalists were influenced by the German translations of the Bhagavad Gita and some of the other things. And that sort of fed into the Thoreau and Emerson and those people. So, and, Boston's formed like a hub with spokes of a wheel. The streets are circles around spokes that come from a center. And when you grow up in that geometry, that sort of really affects his life. So, and so that even I have heard the American Transcendentalist movement defined as a group of people who had nothing in common, but they agreed to disagree and to keep talking to each other. You know, and I think that's really interesting. They were really a diverse group of people who had very different hits on a lot of different social and political and religious and even day-to-day issues, you know. And then the women had their own hit on the transcendentalists, and it was like men who couldn't pay their bills. You know, the women transcendentalists had a very much feet on the ground approach, and apparently wrote some fairly interesting critiques of the impracticality of many of the transcendentalists, that they had to marry skilled women so that their house could run effectively and that their kids wouldn't run wild. You know, I mean, they were not the most practical men. So that's you know, we were talking about that earlier today, in the Goethe Faust group, the male-female balance, and that the totality of ideas is important. And so that's sort of, you know, and Bucky, the other interesting thing is that he was always curious, is a word people have used. And I think he would, when I remember him speaking, and I saw him speak when I was a freshman in college, 1968, the world was exploding. And he reminded me, all over the world, Paris was exploding, Mexico City was exploding, America was exploding into demonstrations and riots. And Bucky would just walk in like your grandfather and tell you, you know, we can fix this. We can just take this apart and work on it, and we can fix this. And it was very inspiring to a whole generation where they were receiving the news saying, I don't know, these problems are just too big. We just can't tackle these problems. And they're just so big. And I don't know why racism persists. And I don't know why the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Well, it's just too big to tackle. And Bucky really gave us tools to sort of break it down and put it back together again. I mean, I think he was constantly playing Humpty Dumpty. The things was falling off the wall and he was putting it back together again, and falling off and putting it back together. And that was a breathing thing that was very important to him, that expansion and the contraction. And the picture you're using has him holding his arms out, which is a Qigong move. And it says, the Qigong people say, you can't remain angry if you hold your arms out like this, because it means you're about to embrace something or somebody. And that's very much Bucky, you know, that, you know, and people spoke to that. I mean, he was deeply flawed in a whole range of odd ways, but many people would just meet him for the first time sitting next to him on the plane, and they just felt like they were talking to their favorite grandfather. And when I walked into the room and saw him, he reminded me of my Mormon bishop grandfather in his suit and his vest and his, you know, all put together, and his glasses. It was the same glass. I just bought them because I may remount the play. And they're these glasses with the metal frames. And my father had a pair kind of like this. My grandfather had a pair like this. And later when I saw Bucky speak, he had a pair of glasses like this. And that was at the College of Creative Studies in Santa Barbara, where my brother was a painter. And I showed this to Kant earlier today. This is a Christmas ornament my brother made after studying with Bucky at the College of Creative Studies, and he tried to integrate symbols from all the world's religions into this. And by the time my brother made this, he was a pretty strict atheist. But I kind of used to call him the atheist saint, you know, because he was just, you know, really liked kids, and he would teach them music and basketball and, you know, and just make his tools available for them to work on. So there's pretty obvious 5-pointed stars in this, but there are also implied 6-pointed structures and hexagons and different things that you see in Islam and Sufism, which I'm not sure my brother knew much about that at that time, but he certainly knew about symbols from Islam and different, which were very geometrically oriented. So, and this is sort of like Bucky's ideas are not do what Bucky did, but he gives you some tools, these little elements, tetrahedron, octahedron, icosahedron. And once you sort of really study those tools, the individual can do anything with it. And my brother, an atheist, loved Christmas. And he loved buying gifts for kids, and he makes a universal Christmas ornament out of it. So
Doug,
it's
in honor of the World Cup, can you show the soccer ball?
oh yeah. What I did with that? Oh, here it is. It's right by my hand. This is the soccer ball, which is also the pentagons and hexagons, and I always thought this was similar to Bucky's ideas, but apparently this design for the saga ball was informed by Buckminster Fuller's geometry. So you just come up with an idea and people like go crazy with it around the world. You know, all kinds of memes start to come out of these very simple elements. And it's also the truth. The comprehensiveness is getting to the truth. And this is where he's surprisingly like Gandhi, because Gandhi's autobiography is called The Story of My Experiments with Truth. And almost any book Bucky wrote could have the same title. These are this year's experiments with truth. And then the next year he writes another book because the truth is modulated for him a bit and it's gotten bigger, or he's gotten a fresh angle on it. And he didn't give speeches. He would think out loud in front of an audience. And he would, because he would pay attention to the audience and to the room and listen and say, what do these people need to hear? And sometimes he'd go into a completely new idea live in front of an audience because he was actually dealing with reality moment to moment. And that's what I tried to recreate in the play. And that sort of attention is also what students would go, oh, he's really thinking about the same things we are. That every kid wants to tackle the biggest problems. Why is there war? And so he tackled that problem and came up with a range of ideas and reasons for why that continues to persist. But those were, I think even though half the time you couldn't even understand what he was talking about when you listened to him speak, you would go about 15 minutes going, I don't get this, I don't get this. And then suddenly you realized you jumped on the train of his thought and you were following everything he was saying. You know, it was just like you'd finally caught the train and it swept you along and you could follow what he was saying. And that's also what I tried to do in the play. The play is written for the audience to be confused at times. And then like a kid go, I get it, I understand that makes sense, or that's funny, or that moves me, or that's, in fact, one woman who was around the theater a lot when I created this play, when she was younger, she got impatient with the family stuff, right? I hate that. I like the science and the ideas and the philosophy. And then 10 years later, she helped produce it at San Jose Rep, and she brought it in. And she was a mother by that time. And suddenly the science bored her, and the family stuff just knocked her out, you know? And so it's like the play, you come at Bucky from a different angle at a different time, and he's completely different. That's how comprehensive it is. And Scott Eastham, who died a while ago, and I didn't discover his book until I was in Poland. This is how weird things happen. He wrote a book called American Dreamer and Sacred Geometry. And in his intro, he actually says Bucky was a one-man symposium. You know, the way some people are a one-man band, he was a one-man symposium. He could do, this hour he could be talking about economics, that hour he could be talking about poetry and art, and this hour he could be singing a song. It's like he's also a one-man sort of Chautauqua. He could do it all, you know. He danced badly, as Allegra said. He sang like a foghorn, which all of his family testifies to, but he was not afraid of singing or dancing. And he credits Allegra with teaching him how to move during his lectures. And somebody told me this time at an event at a gym at UCLA, and he was chasing a huge beach ball across the gymnasium floor, which is an image that just sticks in my mind, that he had this joy. I think there was a lot of Tom Sawyer about him, too. At one of the productions, I was reading Tom Sawyer, and realizing there's a lot of that just 8-year-old bravado about Bucky, you know, that was going, wow, this is cool. Wow, this is great. And it's... And achieving the inner child, not the inner child, but the child's approach was for him a very difficult discipline. How do you return to seeing the world without being filtered by everything you've been taught? How do you just actually witness what's going on? And I think I'd had the idea to write a play, and I finally quit, the specific form of my job at running a theater, because I'd gone deaf, dumb, and blind, and I'd gone a year without thinking much about the project, and I was retreating to the mountains. And I was in the mountains long enough to relax, the way Bucky would go maybe to Bear Island and relax and watch nature. And suddenly I'm looking at the ground, and I'm seeing the little stones and pieces of grass and sticks and weeds, and much in the way I remember looking at the pattern of plants in my grandparents' lawn when I was like 1 year old. I was on my stomach looking at this fabric of life in the grass. And I was there for 2 weeks before I could look at the ground and see it that way, the way I had as a child. And that was a major insight into what the play was about. And I began to then regather my ideas around the play, and took a lot of long walks, which Bucky was a big walker too. If you take long walks, you approach things from different angles. You go through one way and you see a tower in Balboa Park, where I was living when I wrote this play, and in the desert. And then you do a circle around the park and you come back and you see that tower from a completely different angle, or you see the trees from a different angle. And so the play became the circuitous route, approaching his ideas from different angles. And had a lot of the repetition that many people say you should be terrified of in the theater. But in fact, with Bucky, he always returned to things, but it was a variation on what he'd said before. And so it became, with the variations, it became more comprehensive. So I'll leave it with that.
Wow. Wow. Doug, this is so incredible, because, I see that's, you kind of taken in Bucky and you can almost recreate him, almost. It's just wonderful. It's just wonderful, because there is no, you see, human beings are complex, and it is very difficult to actually see how they live, how their consciousness operates, how their bodily movements is shaped by that. And what you have done is that you've taken so much of Bucky within you that you are able to express and show us this. So I really look forward to your participation next year. We're going to be doing this. So just anything that you want to do, I would love to have you do anything.